In February of 1912, a 6-year-old boy was still sitting on a throne inside Beijing's Forbidden City, days after the document ending his own empire had already been signed by someone else in the palace next door. He did not fully grasp what had just happened, and in a sense, neither did most of the country that week. Within roughly a decade, 4 more empires, some of them centuries older than his, would follow the one he had just lost out of existence. This episode counts down 5 empires that were all still standing in the years just before the First World War and were all gone with abdication in February 1912 and the end of the Ottoman Sultanate in November 1922 are 10 years and 9 months apart, which is close enough that this list still earns the word decade even if it runs a little past one. Not the slow, centuries-long erosion empires are supposed to manage in the textbooks. Formal, dated, signed endings, packed into a stretch of time short enough that a single adult life easily spans watching every one of them happen. We are going in order, from the earliest ending to the most recent, and for each one we are asking the person, and the people, standing at the center of it once the empire itself was gone. One note before we start. 2 of these 5 endings involve the killing of a former head of state and his family. This episode is not built around that violence. It is built around the paperwork, the dates, and what grew into the space each empire left behind. In every case here, the ending happened on paper first and everywhere else second. Number 5. The Qing dynasty. China. 1912. The Qing dynasty had ruled China since sometime between 1636 and 1644, depending on how the founding is counted, which put it well past 2.5 centuries old by the time it ended. On February 12, 1912, the abdication of the Xiantong emperor, a 6-year-old boy known to history as Puyi, brought the dynasty to a close. The edict was endorsed by the Empress Dowager Longyu, acting for the child, under a deal brokered by the Prime Minister Yuan Shikai between the imperial court in Beijing and the Republican movement that already controlled the south of the country. The abdication itself came wrapped in a second document, the Articles of Favorable Treatment, which let Puyi keep his imperial title, stay inside the private apartments of the Forbidden City and the Summer Palace, and draw an annual subsidy of 4 million silver taels from the new republic, a subsidy that was never fully paid and was cancelled within a few years anyway. Here is the aftermath, and it is stranger than most. Puyi did not disappear into obscurity. He kept living inside the Forbidden City for years afterward, a boy with no empire, tutored privately while a republic ran the country outside his walls. Then, on March 1, 1934, more than 2 decades after his abdication, he was crowned again. This time as Emperor of Manchukuo, a state carved out of northeast China under Japanese control, where he reigned under a new name until Japan's defeat in 1945. The dynasty ended in a signed edict. Its last emperor did not stay retired. Number 4. The Russian Empire. 1917. The Romanovs had ruled Russia since 1613, when the Zemsky Sobor, an assembly of the country's estates, elected Michael Romanov as Tsar. That is 304 years of continuous rule by one family. It ended on March 15, 1917, by the modern calendar, when Nicholas II abdicated the throne in the Russian city of Pskov, not in a palace, but in a railway carriage, after his own generals told him the army could no longer be counted on to support him. The aftermath here is the part most people already into July 17, 1918, Nicholas, his wife, their 4 daughters, Olga, Tatiana, Maria, and Anastasia, and their young son Alexei were killed at the Ipatov house in the city of Ekaterinburg, along with 4 members of their household who had chosen to stay with them. A dynasty that had lasted longer than most countries do ended with a single family, in a single house, in a single night. What followed took less than 5 years to take shape. On December 30, 1922, delegates formally created the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics. The empire the Romanovs had built did not stay empty for long. Something else, built on entirely different principles, moved into the same territory almost immediately. Number 3. The Austro-Hungarian Empire. 1918. This one had barely existed in the form that collapsed. The dual monarchy of Austria-Hungary was created by the Compromise of 1867, only 51 years before its end, even though the Habsburg family behind it had ruled parts of Central Europe for centuries. On October 17, 1918, the Hungarian parliament voted to end the political union that made the two halves one state, and on October 31, Hungary's new government formally repudiated the arrangement, dissolving the monarchy in practice. On November 11, Emperor Charles issued a carefully worded proclamation in which he recognized the Austrian people's right to determine their own form of government and stated, in his own words, that he waived any share in state affairs. He did not disappear either. In 1921, Charles tried twice to reclaim the throne of Hungary, and failed both times largely because Hungary's own regent refused to back him. On November 19, 1921, Charles and his wife arrived at their final exile, the isolated, heavily guarded Portuguese island of Madeira. He died there on April 1, 1922, of respiratory failure, at just 34 years old, with his pregnant wife and his 9-year-old son in the room. Number 2. The German Empire. 1918. The German Empire was younger still. It had been proclaimed on January 18, 1871, in the Hall of Mirrors at the Palace of Versailles, of all places, while Prussian forces were still besieging Paris. Less than 50 years later, it collapsed in the November 1918 revolution, with the abdication of Kaiser Wilhelm II, and Germany was declared a republic on November 9 of that year. Wilhelm did not stay to watch what came next. He fled into exile in the Netherlands and never returned to Germany. He lived out the rest of his life at a country house called Heusdorn, watching the country he had once ruled go through a republic, a depression, and the rise of a regime that eventually occupied the very ground he was living on. He died there on June 4, 1941, more than 22 years after the empire he was born to inherit had ceased to exist. Number 1. The Ottoman Empire. 1922. The Ottoman Empire is the oldest of the five by a wide margin. It traces back to roughly 1299, when a Turkoman tribal leader named Osman I founded the principality that would eventually grow into it. That is over 600 years of continuous existence, more than twice the age of the next oldest empire on this list, and it is also the last of the five to fall. On November 1, 1922, Turkey's Grand National Assembly declared that the Sultanate itself was abolished, a vote that followed the Turkish War of Independence, led by Mustafa Kemal Ataturk against the occupying Allied powers, which is what put that assembly in a position to abolish anything at all. The last Sultan, Mehmed VI, left Constantinople on a British warship on November 17 of that year and never came back. Less than a year later, on October 29, 1923, the Republic of Turkey was formally proclaimed. And in March of 1924, even the Caliphate, the last remaining religious title still attached to the old dynasty, was abolished as well. An institution that had run for more than 6 centuries was wound down in stages over roughly a year and a half. So here is what these 5 endings actually have in common, and it is not what you would guess from the outside. The 5 did not have equal claims to age, either. The Ottoman line traced back to 1299, which made it about 623 years old when its last sultan sailed away. The Qing dynasty was somewhere around 270 years old. The Romanovs had run for 304 years. And then there is the pair that make the whole list look younger than it is. The dual monarchy of Austria-Hungary was created by a compromise in 1867 and was only 51 years old when it ended. The German Empire, the older idea of German unity, was proclaimed in 1871 and lasted just 47 years. 2 of the 5 empires that vanished within a decade of each other had, in strict institutional terms, barely outlived a single long human life. None of them ended the way a slow decline is supposed to end. The Qing dynasty issued a formal abdication edict. The Romanovs were removed by their own generals before anyone laid a hand on them. Austria-Hungary's parliament voted itself out of a treaty. Germany's revolution produced a declared republic within hours. Turkey's own assembly voted the Sultanate away in a single sitting. Every single one of these was a paper act first, before it was anything else. And every single one of the people at the center of it kept living, in some form, after the paperwork was signed. Puyi came back as somebody else's emperor. Charles tried to come back as himself, twice, and failed. Wilhelm watched from a country house in another nation for over 2 decades. Mehmed VI sailed away on a warship that wasn't even his own country's. Nicholas is the one exception, and even there, the empire that replaced his was founded before the decade that killed him was even over. Here is the question I want to leave you with. Every single record we have of these 5 endings describes an official signing a paper, voting in a chamber, or issuing a proclamation. Calm, procedural, correctly dated. If you had been in that room, with only the information available at the time, would you have known you were watching the end of something 600 years old, or would it have? Answer in the comments. The next episode leaves human institutions behind entirely and asks what happens to a city once every single person who lived in it is simply gone. Thanks for watching.